A ruthless restaurant manager mocks a simple-looking man, only to freeze in terror when he learns the shocking truth. What happens next changes everything. The Grand Étoile was the crown jewel of New York's fine dining scene, a place where the wealthy and influential gathered under golden chandeliers, discussing business deals over imported wines and rare delicacies. Every detail, from the velvet-lined chairs to the soft murmur of the classical piano, exuded exclusivity. To dine here wasn't just about the food, it was about status. Ethan Reynolds had spent years climbing the ranks to become the maitre d'. To him, the restaurant was more than a job. It was a fortress of prestige, a space reserved for those who belonged. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue suit, Ethan moved through the dining room with effortless confidence, ensuring that every guest met the restaurant's unspoken standard of wealth and importance. So when the front doors swung open and a man in worn jeans, a faded flannel, and scuffed boots walked in, Ethan's instincts kicked in immediately. He didn't belong. Keanu Reeves stepped inside, his movements relaxed, as if oblivious to the stares that followed him. He took in the lavish decor, the towering floral arrangements, the waiters gliding between tables in perfect synchronization. He was no stranger to elegance, but he had never measured a place's worth by its extravagance. Ethan, standing behind the mahogany podium, narrowed his eyes as Keanu approached. "Good evening," he said smoothly, though his smile barely concealed his skepticism. "How can I assist you?" "I'd like a table, please," Keanu said, his voice calm and polite. Ethan hesitated, glancing over the man's attire with a flicker of judgment. The shirt was slightly wrinkled, the jacket well worn. No designer logos, no sleek Italian leather shoes. Nothing about him screamed high society. The maitre d's practiced smile tightened. "Sir, we have a strict reservation policy. I assume you have one?" Keanu nodded. "No reservation. Just thought I'd stop by." Ethan let out a small, almost amused chuckle. "I see." He leaned slightly over the podium, lowering his voice. "I should mention that our menu is quite exclusive. We offer a highly curated experience, and the minimum spend is—" "Doesn't matter," Keanu interrupted, still smiling. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the effortless confidence in Keanu's tone. He wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not by someone who, by all appearances, had no business being here. "Right." The maitre d' cleared his throat and gave a tight nod. "Just a moment." He turned sharply and strode toward the reservations desk, muttering something to a young hostess. "Run his name," he instructed. The hostess, confused, typed into the system. After a few moments, she shook her head. "Nothing?" Ethan smirked, exactly as he expected. He took a slow breath, preparing to return to Keanu with some well-rehearsed excuse, but as he turned around, something made him hesitate. The way Keanu stood, calm, patient, unshaken, was unnerving. He had seen wealthy clients throw fits over minor inconveniences, but this man, someone who shouldn't even have stepped foot in the restaurant, wasn't fazed at all. Ethan straightened his tie and walked back to the front, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "Well, as I suspected, we don't have a reservation under your name." He clasped his hands together. "Unfortunately, we are fully booked for the evening." Keanu glanced around the half-filled dining room, arching a single eyebrow. "Plenty of tables available." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged. "Our open tables are reserved for high-priority guests," he said, forcing a diplomatic tone. "I could perhaps seat you at the bar?" Keanu smiled slightly. "I'll take a regular table." Ethan took a deep breath, quickly weighing his options. If he outright refused, he risked causing a scene. He had no idea who this man was, just that he wasn't one of them. With an air of forced politeness, Ethan grabbed a menu and gestured toward the farthest, least desirable table in the restaurant. It was tucked away near the kitchen doors, where the hum of dishwashers and the clang of silverware would overshadow the refined atmosphere of the dining room. "This way," Ethan said briskly. Keanu followed, his expression unreadable as they weaved through the room. As they passed, a few diners exchanged glances. An older woman in pearls whispered something to her husband, who shook his head disapprovingly. Across the room, a sharply dressed man tapped his fingers against his wineglass, watching with mild curiosity. Ethan pulled out the chair with a flourish. This should be perfect. Keanu took a seat and looked up at him. "Thanks." Ethan forced another thin smile. "I'll send someone over to take your order." As the maitre d' walked away, he felt a surge of satisfaction. That should send a message. The man wouldn't last 5 minutes. But what Ethan didn't know, what no one in that restaurant knew, was that everything was about to change. Ethan Reynolds returned to the hostess stand, adjusting his tie with an air of self-satisfaction. As far as he was concerned, Keanu Reeves wouldn't last 10 minutes in the Grand Étoile. Still, curiosity nagged at him. Would the man actually go through with it? Turning his gaze toward the dimly lit back corner where he had seated Keanu, Ethan smirked. The location was the least desirable spot in the entire restaurant, a table wedged between the kitchen entrance and a supply station. Every few minutes, a staff member would walk by with trays of dishes, the clatter disrupting the otherwise sophisticated ambiance. Keanu, however, remained unfazed. He opened the menu, his eyes scanning the options with quiet interest. From across the room, Ethan chuckled under his breath. He leaned toward one of the waiters, an eager young man named Jacob. "I give him 5 minutes before he asks for the check and walks out," he muttered. "Some people don't know their place." Jacob hesitated before nodding, but he didn't share Ethan's enthusiasm. There was something about the quiet confidence in Keanu's posture that didn't match the usual reaction of someone who didn't belong. Ethan rolled his eyes and strode back toward Keanu's table, picking up a menu on the way. He arrived with an exaggerated sigh, flipping open his notepad. "Well," he said, his tone barely polite, "have you decided what you'd like, or do you need a recommendation?" Keanu glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I think I'll have the Chateaubriand à la Rossini." Ethan nearly choked. His lips curled into a smirk as he tilted his head. "Interesting choice," he mused. "That's a very refined dish, a signature of our chef." He lowered his voice slightly. "Just to confirm, you do realize that dish is $350, right?" Keanu remained relaxed. "Sounds wonderful." Ethan blinked, momentarily thrown off by the man's indifference. Most people would have at least hesitated at the price tag, but Keanu barely reacted. Recovering quickly, Ethan scribbled down the order with dramatic flair. "All right then," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'll let the kitchen know. Just so you're aware, our chef takes great pride in his work. He prefers his meals to be enjoyed by true connoisseurs." Keanu simply nodded. "I'm sure it'll be an excellent experience." Ethan clenched his jaw, irritated that he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. As he spun on his heels to leave, he muttered under his breath, "Just loud enough for a nearby couple to hear. He's bluffing. Won't even make it to the main course." At the bar, he stopped next to Jacob and smirked. "Still think he's staying?" Jacob hesitated again but shrugged. "He seems comfortable." Ethan scoffed. "Let's see how comfortable he is when the bill arrives." Across the room, Keanu took a sip of water, unfazed by the hostility directed at him. He had been in places like this before, where people measured others not by their character, but by their appearance, their wealth, their status. He glanced around the dining room. A few guests had begun to take notice. A well-dressed woman in a shimmering gown whispered something to her husband, who turned to look at him with curiosity. An elderly man at a corner table lifted his wine glass in a silent toast toward Keanu, as if amused by the unfolding situation. Meanwhile, Ethan, still eager to make his point, deliberately delayed Keanu's order. Instead of sending it directly to the kitchen, he lingered near the VIP tables, chatting with guests, ensuring their meals were expedited. Keanu's dish, however, sat under the warming lamp for longer than necessary. When Ethan finally returned with the plate, he placed it down with a little too much force, causing the silverware to clatter. "Your order," he announced. "Enjoy." Keanu looked up at him, still calm. "Thank you." Ethan lingered for a moment, waiting, expecting a reaction, a sign of discomfort, anything. But Keanu simply picked up his fork and knife, taking a slow, deliberate bite. The tension in the air thickened. More guests were watching now, some pretending not to listen, others fully invested in the scene. Ethan leaned in slightly. "Well?" he asked, trying to keep the smugness from his voice. Keanu took another bite, savoring the dish before answering. "It's excellent." Ethan's smirk wavered. He straightened his posture, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "I'll pass your compliments to the chef." As he turned to leave, his mind raced. This wasn't going the way he expected. Why wasn't Keanu cracking under the pressure? Back at the bar, Jacob glanced at Ethan. "Still think he's bluffing?" Ethan didn't answer. He simply tightened his jaw and poured himself a glass of water, suddenly feeling far less confident than before. And across the room, Keanu continued his meal, his expression serene. This was only the beginning. As Ethan Reynolds continued weaving through the Grand Etoile's lavish dining room, his smirk widened. He had done everything in his power to make Keanu Reeves uncomfortable, yet the man remained frustratingly composed. Seated in the dimly lit back corner, Keanu exuded an almost unshakable serenity. While other guests basked in the restaurant's golden glow, sipping aged wines and discussing business deals, he calmly admired the decor, occasionally glancing toward the pianist's elegant performance. Ethan, however, was determined to make sure this out-of-place guest wouldn't get too comfortable. He strutted back to Keanu's table, his notepad in hand, and cleared his throat dramatically. "All right, then," he said, a malicious glint in his eye. "Just to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings later, I strongly suggest you double-check the prices. We wouldn't want any unpleasant surprises when the bill arrives." Keanu simply looked up, his expression unchanged. "I'm certain," he said evenly. Ethan let out a theatrical sigh, tapping his pen against the pad. "Very well, as you wish," he muttered, scribbling down the order. "But just so you know, our chef prefers dishes like this to be appreciated by true food connoisseurs." He narrowed his eyes. "I hope it meets your expectations." He turned on his heels, ready to walk away, but at the last moment, he spun back with a sneer. "Oh, and one more thing. The minimum tip expected here is 20%. Keep that in mind while you enjoy." Keanu simply nodded, unfazed. "Thank you for the reminder." Ethan's fingers twitched. No protest, no nervous glance at the menu, just polite acceptance. He hated it. Back at the bar, Ethan poured himself a glass of sparkling water and grumbled, "That guy won't even make it to the main course." Jacob, who had been silently watching the exchange from a distance, shrugged. "He doesn't seem too worried." Ethan scoffed. "Give it time." As Keanu waited, his calm demeanor only irritated Ethan further. When the appetizer finally arrived, Ethan made a point of slamming the plate down just hard enough to make it slide slightly across the table. "Here's your appetizer," he said with a smirk. "I hope you enjoy it, or at least know what you're eating." Keanu picked up his fork without hesitation. "Thank you." Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to something between a whisper and a taunt. "You know, a lot of customers who order this dish end up not liking it. It's not exactly mainstream." He cocked an eyebrow. "But I think you'll do just fine. Good luck." Keanu met his gaze, his voice as steady as ever. "It looks excellent. Thank you for your attention." Ethan straightened, lips tightening. Frustrated that he had, once again, failed to rattle the man, he turned on his heels and stormed away. At the bar, he huffed, "He's bluffing. No way he makes it through the whole meal." Jacob gave him a sideways glance. "He looks fine to me." Ethan crossed his arms. "I bet he's gonna ask for tap water next. These types always do." Meanwhile, Keanu continued his meal leisurely, savoring every bite. Across the restaurant, an elderly guest with neatly combed white hair watched the scene unfold. Smiling faintly, he raised his wine glass in Keanu's direction, a silent toast of admiration. Keanu returned the gesture with a polite nod before taking another bite. But Ethan wasn't done. After taking Keanu's order, he deliberately delayed it. Instead of heading straight to the kitchen, he meandered around, prioritizing what he deemed the important guests. He stopped at an elegant couple's table, laughing exaggeratedly at a joke he didn't care about. He personally delivered a cocktail to a table that wasn't even under his service. All the while, Keanu sat patiently, making no complaint. Ethan, of course, made sure to parade past Keanu's table multiple times, acting as if he were too busy to acknowledge him. Every time Keanu so much as glanced in his direction, Ethan would conveniently avert his gaze and quicken his steps. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, another patron had enough. The elderly man who had been observing everything slowly rose from his table. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, he carried an air of quiet authority as he approached Keanu's corner. He smiled kindly. "Good evening, young man. I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I couldn't help but notice that you've been overlooked." His tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable firmness beneath it. Keanu returned the smile. "Good evening. Don't worry. It's all fine." Ethan, who had been watching from a few feet away, immediately strode over. "Sir, can I help you with something?" he asked the elderly man, his voice suddenly much more polished, as if trying to regain control of the situation. "I wouldn't want you to disturb our customer." The elderly man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't believe I'm disturbing him at all." His gaze sharpened as he looked Ethan up and down. "But it seems to me you have been neglecting your duties." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Sir, I assure you—" The man raised a hand, silencing him. "Young man, I have dined in the finest establishments across the world, and let me tell you, the worst kind of service isn't slow service. It's service that's selective." Ethan's face burned. Keanu, still seated, simply observed the exchange, his expression unreadable. The elderly man turned back to him, offering a warm smile. "It was a pleasure speaking with you." "The pleasure was mine," Keanu replied. The moment the elderly man returned to his table, Ethan practically stormed off. At the bar, Jacob whistled under his breath. That looked painful. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Shut up." Back at his table, Keanu took a sip of water, still composed. He knew this night was far from over, but one thing was certain. Ethan Reynolds was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The elderly woman, dressed in a sleek black dress and pearls, leaned slightly closer to Keanu, her wise eyes filled with understanding. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes situations like this test our patience, but I can tell you, remaining composed in the face of arrogance is a rare strength." Keanu smiled slightly, appreciating her words. Before he could reply, Ethan Reynolds, the arrogant waiter, suddenly appeared, stepping between them with a forced professional smile. "Excuse me, ma'am, but Can I help you with something?" His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, as if he was subtly asserting his authority. "I wouldn't want you to disturb our guest." The elderly woman, unfazed by his interruption, narrowed her eyes slightly. "Oh, don't worry, young man. I was just greeting this gentleman. It's refreshing to meet someone with such grace in a place like this." Ethan barely suppressed an irritated sigh, then gestured toward her table. "Well, perhaps you should return to your dinner before your food gets cold," he said, his voice losing its earlier fake politeness. Keanu observed the interaction carefully, his gaze unreadable. The woman held her head high, giving Ethan one last knowing look before turning back to Keanu. "It was a pleasure speaking with you." "The pleasure was mine," Keanu responded with a slight nod. As she walked away, she glanced back once, her expression lingering on Ethan with quiet disapproval. Ethan, however, seemed entirely indifferent, brushing off the exchange as he turned back toward the bar. Ethan had no intention of bringing Keanu's meal out on time. Instead, he lingered in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as the plated dish sat under the warming lamp. He smirked as he made small talk with the chefs, deliberately stalling. Only when he felt enough time had passed, when most customers were already halfway through their meals, did he finally decide to bring Keanu's dish out. Even then, he made a deliberate detour, pausing to serve a group of well-dressed businessmen first, exchanging a few jokes with them, before finally making his way toward Keanu's table. With a smug air, Ethan approached and practically dropped the plate in front of him. "Here's your order," he said, his tone layered with mock hospitality. "I hope you enjoy it." He gave an exaggerated smile before adding, "Oh, and if it's too much for you, don't worry. We can always adjust to something more affordable." A hush fell over the nearby tables. People were listening. Keanu, however, remained utterly unshaken. He looked at the dish, then up at Ethan, his smile unwavering. "It looks excellent, thank you." Ethan's smirk faltered for just a moment. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a taunting whisper. "Are you sure? It's a very sophisticated dish. Might be difficult for someone who's not accustomed to fine dining." Keanu met his gaze with quiet confidence. "I'm sure," he said smoothly. "Thank you for your concern." Ethan clenched his jaw and spun away. The whispers had started. Seated at the bar, Ethan poured himself a drink, barely hiding his irritation. "He's pretending to be polite," he muttered to a co-worker, an exhausted bartender who was clearly trying to ignore him. "But I know he's uncomfortable. Guys like him always are. They come here trying to play rich, but they just embarrass themselves." The bartender forced a neutral smile. "Maybe he just wants to have dinner, Ethan. Maybe we should treat him like any other customer." Ethan scoffed, setting his glass down with a clink. "Like any other customer? Did you see his boots? The man doesn't belong here, and frankly, if he can't handle it, he shouldn't have walked through the door." At a nearby table, a well-dressed couple exchanged uneasy glances, having overheard every word. The woman shook her head in disbelief. "He's awful," she whispered. "The man has been nothing but polite, and that waiter keeps pushing him." The man frowned, his jaw tightening. "It's disgraceful," he agreed. "I think we should say something to the manager." Keanu finished his meal slowly, undisturbed. Despite the clear mistreatment, he never wavered, never flinched. His eyes occasionally flicked around the room, noting the sympathetic glances from nearby diners. Many had caught on to the way Ethan had been treating him. A few were still whispering, casting disapproving looks toward the bar. Yet Keanu, as always, remained composed. Finally, Ethan returned to clear the plate, barely concealing his disdain. "So," he drawled, "how was it? Did it meet your expectations?" Keanu calmly wiped his mouth with a napkin before looking up. "It was excellent," he said evenly. "Please give my compliments to the chef." Ethan's eyebrows twitched in surprise. He had expected a complaint, an irritated remark, something. Instead, all he got was effortless composure. "Well," he muttered, "glad to hear it." As he turned to leave, he couldn't resist adding one last jab. "Of course, the real challenge comes when the bill arrives," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see if you're still smiling then." Keanu simply sipped his water, unconcerned. From across the room, the elderly woman from earlier set down her wine glass and whispered to her dinner companion, "I have a feeling this is about to get very interesting." The older gentleman nodded. "That waiter has no idea what he's gotten himself into." Unbeknownst to Ethan, the eyes of the entire dining room were now on Keanu's table. The moment of reckoning was coming, and Ethan Reynolds had no idea how much his world was about to change. Ethan Reynolds returned to the table with a forced, insincere smile. He set down Keanu's empty plate with a little too much force, as if hoping it would shake him. "So," he said, folding his arms across his chest, "how was the dish? Did it meet your expectations?" His voice dripped with condescension. Keanu met Ethan's gaze, his expression unreadable. "It was excellent, thank you. Please tell the chef they did an impeccable job." Ethan's smirk faltered. He had expected a complaint, some small sign of discomfort, anything he could use to further his game. Instead, Keanu's response was unwavering, polite, and utterly unbothered. Ethan muttered under his breath loud enough for those nearby to hear, "He might be smiling now, but let's see if he still is when the bill comes." He turned away, shaking his head as if amused. Keanu leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. His eyes flicked around the restaurant, calmly observing. The tension in the air was growing. Other diners had taken notice, their murmurs filling the space between clinking silverware and the soft melody of the piano in the background. Ethan, growing increasingly irritated at Keanu's composure, decided to push things further. He returned moments later with the coffee Keanu had ordered and set it down with deliberate roughness. Then, with a raised voice, he turned to his colleague at the bar. "You know, it's hard to maintain standards when just anyone thinks they can walk in here," he said, making sure the words carried across the room. His eyes flicked toward Keanu with a smirk. His coworker stiffened, clearly uncomfortable. "Ethan, maybe we should just—" Ethan cut him off, chuckling. "That's why we have a reservations policy, right? Helps us avoid situations like this." Nearby patrons exchanged glances. Some looked shocked, others visibly uncomfortable. A well-dressed couple who had been quietly observing seemed outraged. The woman placed her hand on her chest. "This is outrageous. He's trying to humiliate the man in public." At another table, the elderly woman from earlier took a slow sip of her wine, her gaze narrowing at Ethan. She turned to her companion and murmured, "This has gone too far." Meanwhile, Keanu remained seated, his expression serene, surveying the room as if this were just another moment in an ordinary evening. But his silence, his patience, seemed to unsettle Ethan more than any reaction ever could. A well-dressed woman 2 tables away whispered to her husband, "He must be someone important to stay this calm. Anyone else would have left by now." "Or," her husband replied, watching Keanu with intrigue, "he's just stronger than Ethan realizes." Ethan, sensing the shift in the room, decided to go for the final blow. He sauntered back to Keanu's table, his smirk growing. "I hope you're enjoying your experience, sir," he said, exaggerating his politeness to the point of mockery. "After all, it's always interesting to have different kinds of people here. Adds a unique touch to the atmosphere." The room went silent. Nearby diners froze, their eyes darting toward Keanu. Keanu finally looked up from his coffee and met Ethan's gaze. His voice was calm, but this time it carried a weight that made Ethan's stomach tighten. "Different?" Keanu repeated, his tone cool and measured. "Could you explain what you mean by that?" Ethan let out a nervous chuckle, but the confidence in his smirk was slipping. "Oh, don't take it the wrong way," he said quickly. "It's just that, well, our clientele typically has a certain profile. It's rare to see someone with your style here." Gasps rippled through the room. Conversations halted. A waiter carrying a tray nearly dropped a glass. Ethan, oblivious to the shifting energy around him, still believed he was in control. His grin widened as he noticed how many people were watching. That was until the manager arrived. The restaurant manager, a man in his late 50s with neatly combed silver hair and an air of strict professionalism, entered the dining room with a sharp eye, clearly sensing something was off. He scanned the room, then spotted Keanu, and his entire demeanor changed. His face went pale for a moment before he quickly composed himself. He moved swiftly toward the table, completely ignoring Ethan. "Mr. Reeves," the manager said, his voice laced with urgency and respect. "I wasn't aware you were visiting us tonight. Please let me know how I can assist you." The restaurant fell into absolute silence. Ethan froze. The blood drained from his face as he whipped his head toward Keanu, his mind racing. "Mr. Reeves!" The words echoed in his head like a cruel joke. Keanu simply sipped his coffee, setting the cup down with a quiet clink before finally speaking. His tone was unchanged, calm as ever. "Now," he said, his voice commanding yet composed, "let's talk about how we treat people." Ethan staggered back. The weight of the moment crashed down on him. The people who had been whispering were now staring directly at him. The elegant couple at the center table exchanged knowing glances. The elderly woman in the corner folded her hands together, her lips curling into the smallest, most satisfied smile. Ethan had spent the evening humiliating a man he thought was beneath him. But now the truth was staring him in the face. He hadn't just insulted a random diner. He had insulted one of the restaurant's owners. His throat went dry as he glanced at the manager, who was now looking at him with pure disappointment. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Reynolds felt fear. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Everyone was watching, and Ethan's world was about to crumble. The manager of the Étoile, a man with flawless posture and an air of quiet authority, stood rigidly as he processed the scene before him. The tension in the dining room was thick, eyes darting from him to Keanu Reeves to the trembling server beside them. Without sparing him a glance, he turned directly to Keanu, his expression shifting from confusion to sharp recognition. His demeanor transformed instantly. Gone was the neutral hospitality. In its place was genuine deference. "Mr. Reeves," he said with a composed but urgent tone, leaning slightly in a subtle bow of respect. "I wasn't aware you were visiting tonight. Please accept my sincerest apologies for any inconvenience. Is there anything I can do to improve your experience?" At that moment, Ethan Reynolds froze. His heart pounded in his chest as realization struck like a bolt of lightning. He felt the blood drain from his face. "Mr. Reeves? He knows him? What's happening?" His mind raced, trying to make sense of the unfolding nightmare. Keanu, still as composed as ever, offered the manager a small smile. "Thank you, but I don't need special treatment. I'd just like to have a conversation with your staff, if that's not too much trouble." The manager's jaw tightened slightly. A man of precision and order, he had already grasped the gravity of the situation. His eyes flicked toward Ethan, who was standing like a statue, his earlier arrogance replaced by sheer panic. "Of course, Mr. Reeves," the manager said quickly. Then, with an edge of steel in his voice, he turned to Ethan. "Step forward." Ethan snapped out of his frozen state at the manager's command, swallowing hard as he stepped closer. I didn't know," Ethan stammered. I thought... The manager cut him off, his voice dangerously low. Thought what, Ethan? That this guest, one of the owners of this restaurant, didn't deserve respect? Or were you just judging him based on what you decided he was worth? A hush fell over the dining room. Ethan opened his mouth, searching for an excuse, but there was none. The moment stretched on as he floundered for words. Keanu broke the silence, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of an undeniable truth. I don't need to introduce myself to deserve common courtesy. He let the words settle, scanning the room. No one should have to. The restaurant patrons sat motionless, absorbing every syllable. The elegant couple near the center of the room exchanged approving glances. The elderly man, who had been silently observing all evening, gave a satisfied nod. A whispered conversation spread like a current through the diners. I knew there was something about him. His presence is impossible to ignore. Look at how he's handling this. Pure grace. I wonder if Ethan's regretting his choices now. The manager turned back to Ethan, his expression unreadable. Your shift ends early tonight. Report to my office before you leave. Ethan clenched his jaw, nodding stiffly. He had no way out of this. His fists balled tightly at his sides as he turned on his heel, walking away with his head low, avoiding the burning stares from every direction. Keanu exhaled quietly before standing. All eyes locked onto him. He swept his gaze across the restaurant, his voice low yet powerful as he addressed them all. The Étoile was built on the idea that it would be a place of warmth, where everyone is treated with dignity. He paused, his expression unreadable. Unfortunately, tonight, that was not the case. Silence. Everyone was listening. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from it. Keanu turned to the manager, his eyes steady. I'd like to speak to your staff once the restaurant closes. There are things we need to address. The manager nodded immediately. Of course, Mr. Reeves. I'll arrange it. Keanu nodded in return before taking his seat once more, as if the storm that had passed through the restaurant had never even touched him. The dining room slowly returned to its rhythm, but the air was charged. Patrons continued to murmur, exchanging glances. Later that night, after closing time, the staff of the Étoile stood in tense silence in the now empty dining room, their eyes locked on Keanu Reeves. He stood at the center, hands in his pockets, his presence commanding but not intimidating. We all make mistakes, Keanu began, his voice even and firm. But what matters is how we choose to correct them. The room was completely still. Tonight was about more than just bad service. It was about perception, about the consequences of judging someone before knowing their story. Keanu's eyes swept over the group, landing on Ethan, who stood near the back, his head bowed in shame. Ethan, the young man tensed. Keanu's voice remained calm, but resolute. I'm not here to humiliate you. I want to know. Do you understand what happened tonight? Ethan exhaled sharply, looking up, his voice strained but honest. Yes, I judged someone based on appearance. I was arrogant, and I made a mistake. Keanu nodded, his gaze never wavering. And what will you do about it? Ethan swallowed. I need to be better. I need to stop assuming I know who people are based on what they wear or how they look. Keanu studied him for a moment before offering a small nod. Good. Change starts with awareness. Ethan looked down, but this time there was determination in his expression, not just shame. Keanu turned to the rest of the staff. You all saw what happened tonight. It wasn't just one person's mistake, it was a reflection of something bigger. A few of the waiters nodded quietly. Keanu took a deep breath before finishing. It's not about a job, it's about the kind of person you choose to be. If this restaurant is to truly be great, it can't just be about elegance and exclusivity. It must be a place of respect for everyone. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. The manager stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Reeves, I think we all understand now. Changes will be made." Keanu nodded, satisfied. As he turned to leave, Ethan, his voice shaky, called out, "Mr. Reeves?" Keanu turned, raising a brow. Ethan took a breath. "Thank you." Keanu simply smiled. "Make it count." As he stepped out of the étoile, the city lights shimmering around him, Keanu reflected on the night's events. Tonight hadn't just been about him. It had been about a lesson, a moment of self-awareness for many. And sometimes the greatest transformations start with a single choice. As he walked down the quiet street, Keanu Reeves disappeared into the city. But his message remained. A heavy silence hung in the dimly lit dining room of the étoile, the air thick with reflection and tension. The staff stood in a semicircle, their eyes darting between one another, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the uneasy quiet. But it was Keanu Reeves' voice that filled the space once again. He took a slow step forward, his presence commanding yet calm, his gaze settling on Ethan Reynolds, who stood at the back of the group. His once proud posture was now hunched, his arms tightly crossed, his face pale with the weight of the night's events. "Ethan," Keanu said, his voice neither accusatory nor soft. "What happened tonight was a mistake. But mistakes don't define us. What does is how we choose to grow from them." The young waiter tensed, his throat tightening. For the first time that night, his arrogance had completely disappeared. He blinked rapidly, as if fighting off the wave of emotions that threatened to surface. He hesitated, swallowing hard. "I never thought about it that way before." His voice was barely above a whisper. The entire staff remained frozen, watching the moment unfold. Even the restaurant manager, normally composed and in control, stood silently, his expression unreadable. Keanu's voice remained steady. "I want you to ask yourself something, Ethan. What would have happened tonight if I wasn't me? If I wasn't Keanu Reeves, if I didn't have a name that made people take a second look, would anything have changed?" Ethan's breath hitched. He knew the answer. Nothing would have changed. He would have continued to belittle a customer based purely on assumptions. He lowered his gaze, shame pressing down on his chest like a weight. "I was wrong." Keanu nodded slowly, then turned to face the entire staff. "The world makes it easy for us to judge others at first glance," he began. "We see clothes, appearances, accents, cars, and we think we know someone's worth. But what if we took a step back? What if we chose kindness instead of assumption?" A few of the staff shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the message sinking in. The bartender, a quiet young man who had kept his head down throughout the night, nodded slightly. The hostess, who had nervously witnessed the evening's events but never intervened, wiped her hands against her dress, looking down. Keanu continued, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. "We all carry burdens no one else can see. The man who doesn't fit in might be carrying the heaviest load. The one who doesn't look the part might have achieved more than we can imagine. But the real question is, what kind of person do we choose to be?" The words rippled through the room like a quiet storm. Ethan finally lifted his head, his eyes red with unshed tears. His voice wavered, but there was an undeniable sincerity in his tone. "I was too focused on status, on maintaining the restaurant's standards, that I forgot what really matters. I forgot that people matter." He exhaled shakily, a deep breath filled with realization. "I want to change. I will change." Keanu watched him for a long moment before giving a small nod. "That's not a promise to me, Ethan. That's a promise to yourself. Keep it." A subtle but significant shift filled the room. It was more than just a reprimand. It was a lesson that had cracked something open inside every person present. The manager stepped forward, his tone laced with both regret and newfound determination. "Mr. Reeves, I assure you, we will do better. This restaurant will reflect the values it was built on. Tonight was a wake-up call." Keanu studied the older man for a moment before offering a slight smile. "Good. Let's make sure this place truly welcomes everyone." A night to remember. As Keanu stepped out into the cool night, the city lights shimmered like jewels against the dark sky. He paused at the entrance of the Etoile, his hands in his pockets, taking one last look at the restaurant. He had walked in as a stranger, been dismissed as unworthy, but left having planted a seed, a reminder that true value lies not in status, but in character. As he began walking down the sidewalk, the night alive with the hum of distant traffic, Keanu reflected on what had transpired. It hadn't just been about him, it had been about something much bigger. The arrogance of one person had been exposed, but so had the silent indifference of many. And yet, by the end of the night, something had changed. Perhaps tonight had been a lesson not just for Ethan, but for everyone who had sat in that restaurant, watching, whispering, judging, or staying silent. Because, in the end, kindness isn't just about grand gestures. It's in the small choices we make every single day. It's in how we see others, how we choose to treat them. And above all, it's in the moments where we decide, consciously, to be better. Keanu smiled softly as he disappeared into the city. The lesson of the night would live on. Because in a world that often measures worth by appearances, status, and wealth, the greatest strength of all is kindness, and real respect is given, not demanded. Life lesson from the story. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to judge people based on appearances, wealth, or status. However, true character is revealed in how we treat others, regardless of their background. Keanu Reeves' story teaches us that kindness, humility, and respect are far more valuable than material success. Before making assumptions, take a moment to look beyond the surface. Everyone has a story we don't know. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe True Tapes channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you.